Hello there, and welcome to Somm Saturdays with Treveri Cellars, a series of videos where we discuss pairing sparkling wine and food. My name is Wilson Cecil. I am a certified sommelier with a Court of Master Sommeliers, and I work in sales and marketing for Treveri. If you found yourself here without knowing who or what Treveri Cellars is, that's fine. Treveri is the only all-sparkling wine production of Washington State. What that means is we make wines in the same style essentially as champagne, but we make them with fruit sourced exclusively from Washington State and primarily from the Yakima Valley within Washington. But while the winery is based in Washington, I am based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So welcome to the channel, welcome to this video, and welcome to my home. Since this is the first video on the channel, I thought that we would start with a wine that is at the heart of almost every sparkling wine production's lineup, and that is our Blanc de Blanc Brut. Blanc de Blanc is just sparkling wine speak for a white wine made from white-skinned grapes, and Brut indicates that while it is not completely bone dry, it is on the drier end of the spectrum of sparkling wine, which is to say it has lower levels of sugar. And what are we going to be pairing with the wine? Today we're going to be doing a little tacos al pastor. If you aren't familiar with al pastor, it's a pork taco marinated with chilies and vinegar and achiote paste, as well as some spices in there, grilled and served with a little pineapple and onion in the mix. I'm not huge on doing multi-day recipes if I can avoid it, but al pastor definitely is something that you're going to want to marinate in the fridge overnight. So in a second, I'm going to cut away to me putting together the marinade for the pork. I'm also going to, of course, be including the recipe for the al pastor in the box down below. I actually use a Food and Wine magazine recipe that I think works really well. Al pastor traditionally is stacked up, cooked on a spit, shaved off of this kind of stack of meat. And while that would be awesome, I just don't have that at home. So I do it on the grill in skewers. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But while you watch this bit about the marinade, I'm going to be working on tortillas. Of course, you can use store-bought tortillas, but I'm going to be making fresh tortillas. I'm not going to go into that necessarily in this video, but super simple. Whoopsie daisies. Maseca, salt, water, tortilla press. Tortilla presses are cheap. They're pretty easy to find at most grocery stores, and it really improves the quality of your tacos. And who doesn't want better tacos? All right, let's get started with this marinade. So, gonna kick off with a tablespoon of neutral vegetable oil over medium heat, and we'll let that heat up until it's ready for 3 cloves of garlic. Those are gonna cook until nice and golden, at which point we will add in 1 teaspoon of oregano, a half a teaspoon of cumin, and 1/4 teaspoon of cloves. Give that a little shake since I got a little zealous with the heat, and we'll let that cook just for a little bit until we're ready to add our guajillo chilies. Guajillo chilies are the dried version of Marisol chili peppers from Mexico. They're not terribly spicy as long as you devein and de-seed them. And we've done just that. That's 3 chilies I just added, and we're going to cook them until they're a little bit dark and blistered on the surface. After the guajillos have cooked for a couple minutes, we're going to add 1/4 cup of white vinegar, a 1/3 cup of pineapple juice. I use fresh pineapple juice, and 2 tablespoons of achiote paste. So achiote paste actually comes from the achiote tree, and the seeds are super orange, and they actually are used to make annatto, which is the dye that gives cheddar cheese its color traditionally. and other orange cheeses. So anytime you see a cheese that has that really vibrant orange, it's coming from achiote paste. One thing you want to make sure of is to not be like me and almost forget your pepper. That's about a half a teaspoon. We're going to add and make sure that it gets mixed in well with everything else. And while we let that simmer, we'll clean up a little bit. Give it about 5 to 7 minutes on the stovetop until we are ready to turn off the flame and let it cool down. Once it's cooled enough, we'll add it to our food processor, or if you have a blender, that's just fine, of course, and we'll blitz it until smooth. Once we're happy with the consistency, we'll add it to our pork shoulder, which in my case, I've broken down into kebab or stew size, like 1-inch cubes, and it's ready to go into a container and marinate overnight. So the meat's marinated overnight, and I just got it out of the fridge. I'm gonna throw it on some skewers, slice some pineapple and some red onion. The pineapple and the red onion are both gonna be sliced down to about 1/4 inch. I'm gonna sear them really hard on the grill. Let's do this. Alrighty then, we've got our onion, pineapple, and our meat's all skewered up. I'm going to cut away. We'll see if we can get a little bit of footage of this all cooking, but the next time that you'll see me is back here to knock out some tortillas and talk reasoning behind pairing. With the meat done, got a nice char on the pork as well as the pineapple and the onion. Let's talk a little bit about how I think about pairing food and wine. Let me interrupt past me and say that I'm about to get pretty off the rails. So we're going to jump to now, a few days in the future, and actually talk about how I look at pairing. We're going to use some visual aids, and hopefully this helps contextualize what I was thinking then and how I approach pairings moving forward. Whenever I approach a pairing, I try to consider both the flavor and the texture of the food and wine. For this video, we are going to focus on flavor. Full disclosure, a lot of this comes from my favorite guide to flavor pairings, which was put together by Wine Folly. Madeline Puckett has some outstanding resources for learning about wine. If you haven't visited Wine Folly to check out their awesome content, make sure to pay them a visit when you are done here. Our palates can perceive a truly amazing variety of flavors and flavor combinations, which I am representing here with these silly little bits of confetti. The world is full of tastes to experience, but when it comes to thinking about wine and food pairings, we can focus on 6 central elements of flavor: salt, fat, acid, sweetness, bitter flavors, and heat or spice. Foods that contain or express these elements of flavor might look something like this. Salt might be introduced to a dish by an ingredient such as cheese, though more often than not it is likely coming from the direct addition of salt. Fat in a dish might come from an ingredient like avocado, which I definitely misspelled here, oil, cheese once again, and dairy more generally, and meats ranging from fish to poultry to pork and red meats. Acid is one of my favorite elements in cooking. I feel it adds a kind of energy to dishes. We might add acid to food through the inclusion of citrus fruits like lemon and or lime, or fermented products like vinegar. I wanted to add dressings on here as a reminder that all these flavor elements can be introduced to a dish as part of another seemingly separate ingredient. Sweetness might come from foods with naturally occurring sugars like fruit and honey, or something which includes sugar like chocolate. And of course, we can add refined sugar for sweetness in a dish. When it comes to foods, bitterness is a flavor that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, for better or worse. We certainly find it in varying intensities in leafy greens. We can get distinct bitterness from citrus rind, and here I forgot to include something we actually just saw, chocolate. Dark chocolate in particular brings strong bitterness to a dish. Bitterness is a much larger part of my thinking when considering wine. And while this is getting ahead of myself a bit, one of the major contributors to bitterness in wine, and one of the most integral parts of red wine's texture, is tannin. But more on that later. And last on our list of flavor elements is spice, or heat. The most obvious source of spice in our food is chili peppers, but I think it's worth remembering that even black pepper can add a particular kind of heat to dishes. While the world of food contains all 6 of these flavors, wines tend to be defined by one of only 3 of these: acid, bitterness, or sweetness. All wines typically contain these 3 flavors in varying degrees, but are dominated, again, in general, by one. When we consider wines that are defined primarily by their acidity, we might think of white wines like Chenin Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Sauvignon Blanc. When it comes to red wines, one of my favorite acid-driven wines is Gamay. Acid is also the defining flavor element of most sparkling wines. As I mentioned just a moment ago, bitterness in wine comes from tannin. But what exactly is tannin? Tannin is extremely fine, undissolved particulate that we find primarily in red wines. If you have had over-steeped black tea and felt the mouth-drying, almost chewy sensation it has, that comes from tannin in the tea. If you have had the same sort of sensation while drinking a glass of red wine, that's tannin too. It comes from grape skins, stems, and seeds, and is primarily extracted when letting wine macerate in contact with one or more of these during fermentation. This process is basically universal in red wine making, and quite uncommon in white wine production. So, when we think of bitterness in wine, we typically think of heavy-hitting reds like Cabernet Sauvignon, Nebbiolo, or Sangiovese. Finally, when it comes to sweetness in wines, much like sweetness in food, we think first and foremost of dessert. Dessert wines like port or late harvest wines are good examples. However, there are also wines like Moscato, or one of my favorites to say, Gewürztraminer, which are not necessarily categorized as dessert wines, but typically deliver a decent dose of sugar. In pairing foods with each other or with wine, different elements of flavor work better together than others. We will talk in each of these videos about the combination of flavors I think will work in a given recipe and its paired wine, but I can't overstate how much I think you should follow the link I have shared in the box below to see Wine Folly's breakdown on the flavors that go best together. But while we are here, let's think of a couple examples. Here's a combo most folks are familiar with and generally enjoy: sweet and salty. Caramel corn, melon and prosciutto, or maybe a cheese plate with sweet, ripe fruit. Something a bit less obvious is acid and salt. We might choose an acidic wine to cut salty foods, or we might use acid and salt together to enhance each other in a dish. Think of marinades or dressings that you like. These are likely 2 of the central components. Fat and salt are a killer combo. Who doesn't enjoy a bit of salted butter, or maybe a well-seasoned piece of meat? Salt, fat, and acidity all interplay nicely, so we might pair a crisp, bright wine against a rich, creamy cheese. Keeping on track with food and wine combinations, here's one that I bet most of you watching have heard of. Bitterness does well with both salt and fat. Like I mentioned before, one salt and fat combination is a well-seasoned piece of meat, so the bitterness of a Cabernet Sauvignon plays well against a well-seasoned steak. Another happy trio is spice alongside that familiar duo of sweet and salty. Something that I really enjoy is a sweet and spicy Serrano margarita with a salt rim. As far as food and wine go, Something like a Thai curry that combines heat from chilies with salty fish sauce paired with semi-sweet Gewürztraminer is a quite successful pairing. And one final example: sweetness, salt, and fat. And a wine pairing for this combination of flavors, let's have port stand in for our sweet element and do a little math. Salt plus dairy equals cheese. Port and similar dessert wines are familiar bedfellows with cheese and wine pairing. A quick note: you can see here that we are looking primarily at one or two flavors of food and then the defining characteristic of the wine. We can get more granular than that, which we will discuss in a moment, but this is generally sufficient to put together a successful food and wine pairing. For all the things that pair well, there are some flavors that simply do not get along. Generally, this is acid, bitterness, and spice. We want to avoid these combinations: acid with bitterness, bitterness with spice or heat, and spicy food with acid. All are unpleasant combinations when building a dish or building a pairing, so we try to avoid them. Keeping in mind some of what we've discussed, let's consider the wine and food we are pairing today: Al Pastor and Treveri's Blanc de Blanc. With the dish, we have a number of flavors working together, but primarily we are looking at salty, savory pork with sweet pineapple. The wine is defined by flavors of apple and lemon, but is primarily driven by acid. And one final note on this pairing: I knew I wanted to try something off the beaten path for this first Somm Saturday. So I actually started with a book that I bought some years ago, Molecules and Taste by Francois Cartier. This book delves into the nitty-gritty of chemical components found in wine and food. Looking at what Cartier says about Chardonnay and what pairs with it, he lists two compounds found in both Chardonnay and pineapple: isoamylbutatenate, which communicates a pineapple-y scent, and ethylbutatenate, giving more of the apple aroma we can find in both the fruit and the wine. Paring down to the level of chemical compounds isn't something that most folks are going to need or really want to do at home. But if you want to get into the weeds and find some inspiration for food and wine pairings, maybe pick up a copy of this book. And now for the moment of truth. I have my glass of Blanc de Blanc and my Al Pastor tacos. Let's see how the pairing plays out. I think it works really well. You know, before these videos, I'm always going to research to the best of my ability to find things that are going to work. So hopefully we should never get to this point in a video and say, oh, that's terrible. The idea is that I have a general sense of what I'm doing, right? As much as I might hope that I know what I'm talking about where wine's concerned, obviously this video stuff is still new to me. So I had a little technical difficulty there. I hope that it doesn't throw you guys off totally. Anyhow, regarding the pairing, I think it works quite well, actually. The one note for myself in the future is the chilies are a touch bitter, and the wine isn't particularly sweet. In fact, being brut, it's not sweet at all. And a little sweetness would balance that bitterness really well. But the pineapple and Chardonnay go really well together. The texture of the wine works well with the kind of weight, the texture of the tacos. And overall, sparkling wine, tacos, two things that I love, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I hope that you learned a little bit. I hope that you'll try this pairing, and I hope you'll try pairing sparkling wines with everyday meals a little bit more often. Until I'm back in a couple weeks to post another pairing with another of our wines, stay safe, stay healthy, like and subscribe. You know the drill on YouTube, and I will see you when we're back.